In post-independence India, poetry operates as a calculated structural tool, a deconstructive weapon used to target specific social hierarchies. The context begins in August 1947. While political independence was achieved at the stroke of midnight, the internal, deeply entrenched hegemonies of the newly formed nation, caste boundaries, patriarchal mandates, and institutional monopolies remained intact. To understand the mechanics of this resistance, we can begin by mapping the relationship between dominant systems of power and the specific literary devices used to dismantle them. We will analyze 5 specific poets who used these mechanisms to convert creative work into socio-political critique. By applying specific theoretical frameworks to these texts, we can move past the surface of the verse and decode its function as an architectural blueprint of resistance. To understand the modern Indian identity, we must examine exactly how its literary dissidents work to rebuild it from the ground up. We begin with the philosopher Henri Bergson, who argued that laughter functions as a social corrective, a tool used by society to discipline those who have lost their human vitality. Bergson identified the trigger for the comic as mechanical inelasticity. This occurs when humans behave with rigid, unfeeling autonomism, ignoring the fluid reality of the world around them. Pravin Gadhvi's poem Laughing Buddha targets a specific commercialized artifact, the serene icon mass-produced to sit in affluent lounges as a charm for wealth. Gadhvi executes an inversion of the Bergsonian dynamic. He grants the ceramic Buddha human agency, turning the statue into an active spectator. Instead of society laughing at an eccentric, the solitary Buddha laughs at the corrupt, rigid majority. The target is the Indian ruling class. Politicians and bureaucrats are depicted as components of an unfeeling engine, repeating the same oppressive scripts at power day after day with clockwork cruelty. This utilizes Bergson's prerequisite of the anesthesia of the heart. The Buddha does not react with grief. His laughter is an expression of vairagya, a detached intellectual exposure of a socio-political system that has frozen into a machine. Gadhvi uses Bergsonian mechanics to strip the oppressors of their dignity, suggesting that structural absurdity is the primary vulnerability of an unyielding state. Moving to the second system of power, the university, we find Meena Kandasamy applying a radical approach to mythological deconstruction. In the classical Mahabharata, the student Ekalavya is famously required to sever his own right thumb as an offering to his teacher. This act is traditionally held up as the ultimate symbol of guru bhakti, or sacred devotion. Kandasamy exposes the teacher as a fascist gatekeeper protecting a caste monopoly. The severed thumb becomes a tax on marginalized excellence. Her poem advises left-handed treatment for the biased educator, suggesting both physical adaptation to injury and political radicalism. The poem shifts from documenting systemic injury to asserting power. Kandasamy reminds the student that while they may have been stripped of the thumb required for elite institutional approval, that specific anatomy is unnecessary for modern resistance. The physical requirement for the guru's validation is rendered obsolete. Kandasamy hacks the traditional narrative to move the subject from a state of structural victimization into a posture of active defiance. Our third quadrant relies on confessional poetry.
This style strips away traditional poetic detachment, placing the poet's own life at the center to address taboo subjects like domestic claustrophobia and sexuality. Kamala Das utilized this mode in her poem An Introduction. She addresses a dual pressure: the linguistic expectations of a post-colonial elite and the patriarchal roles imposed on Indian women. Das begins by weaponizing her own linguistic hybridization. Against the gatekeeping of critics and relatives who try to dictate her choice of language, she asserts an autonomous right to speak and write in Indian English. Attacking submissive domesticity, she depicts society forcing her into a rigid gender role through categorized names. The poem climaxes by rejecting these labels entirely. Embracing a fluid identity of sinner and saint, Das expands the personal I into a universal human subjectivity. Das converted the unfiltered documentation of bodily experience into a political reclamation of human subjectivity. The fourth quadrant examines the psychological split of the post-independence identity. In The Patriot, Nissim Ezekiel uses awkward, localized syntax to mimic the clumsy digestion of the colonizer's language. The satire reveals a fractured post-colonial mind. Complex philosophical ideals, like Gandhian nonviolence, are flattened into simplistic slogans as the speaker attempts to perform cosmopolitan awareness in a language he has not fully mastered. Ezekiel highlights the speaker's uncritical optimism. The narrator ignores actual regional tensions and scarcity, retreating into trivial complaints about modern youth to avoid the violent realities of nation-building. We see the spatial counterpart of this fractured identity in Rachna Joshi's Leaving India, which maps the structural paradox of the diaspora. Rachna Joshi identifies a sharp psychological rupture. The safety of North America produces a manicured loneliness, while chaotic memories of Indian streets become more vivid as geographic distance increases. This culminates in the bureaucratic reduction of identity. The act of seeking global citizenship paradoxically reduces the academic to a racialized visa file, forcing a defensive awareness of native roots that did not exist at home. Both Ezekiel and Joshi map an identity caught in a third space, showing that the post-independence mind is an ongoing negotiation between an inaccessible past and an unassimilable future. The completed architecture of our analysis unites these four disparate mechanisms: laughter, myth, confession, and paradox. Across all these texts, we find a shared operational tactic, the active structural inversion of the gaze. This establishes the sovereign subject. In this framework, the marginalized individual refuses to remain the object of study or the fuel for systemic machinery. Instead, they become the active, critical observers of the very society that seeks to exclude them. The physical transition at the Monumental Complex in 1947 marked the birth of a nation, bringing vast crowds into a shared political space. But a change in government did not automatically erase entrenched social hierarchies or the colonial mindsets embedded in the national consciousness. These poets demonstrate that the work of independence continues within the language itself. By rewriting the blueprints of identity, they provide the tools for a psychological liberation that structural political changes alone could not achieve.